Welcome, Jack. So, for those who don't know, Jack has already done a session with us in the past on data-driven product management, and today we are going to discuss on a productful conversations. So, yeah, I would like you to take the session forward from here.
Wonderful. Great. All right. So today we're going to be talking about productful conversations. It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek note to the human interactions that create great products. So to start us off, I'm going to tell a little story. This is one of my favorite stories when it comes to building great products and what it takes to connect with the humans that help us build great products. So um, when Brian Chesky and his co-founders started Airbnb, there's a really fun story of kind of struggle and all this sort of stuff. If you're not familiar with the full Airbnb backstory, I encourage you to go look it up. There's some great stuff like Airbnb selling cereal at the Democratic National Convention in the U.S. here to help fund their first version of their product. That eventually got them into Y Combinator. Y Combinator is a relatively well-known, at least in the Bay Area here, startup accelerator. And during the Airbnb team's time in Y Combinator, Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, asked them, "Where are your users?" And they said, "Oh, well, they're in New York. We have a few users in New York." And Paul Graham told them, "Oh, okay. Well, you better get on a plane and go to New York." And so in an effort to be with their users, the Airbnb team commuted for 3 months while they were in the Y Combinator program between the Bay Area and New York City, visiting with their users, posing as photographers and taking pictures of their homes for their Airbnb profiles, and using that as an opportunity to learn more about what it is that they enjoyed using about the product, watching them use it, they use the term appalled at the user experience and how difficult some of the things that they designed the site to be able to do easily, how hard it was to do them for real people. And they attribute a lot of their early success to that experience of going back and forth and being with their users and having what I like to call productful conversations. Productful conversations are ones that they're the conversations about your product and about users' needs that help bring about great product. So today we're going to talk about how to develop shared understanding and why that's different from shared knowledge. We're going to talk about discussions with users and how you can cultivate an understanding of what your users need. And then we're going to talk about how you can translate that understanding of what users need back to your engineering team. Quick blurb about my background. I graduated from the University of Notre Dame here in the US with a degree in electrical engineering. I started at Pacific Gas and Electric in San Francisco, which is a large public utility company, as an electrical engineer. Realized that I did not like designing circuits. I wasn't quite as good at it as I thought I might be. And so I transitioned to a product management role within PG&E, and I'm happy to get into that at some point if we want. I then started working at a real estate software company called Zap Labs, where I helped them start a data science team as their product manager. And now I'm working at a startup in Mountain View called Qventus, which makes operations software for hospitals with, again, a data science focus. And that's kind of my little niche is data science product management. Also, along the way, I've gotten involved with a few side projects, a bunch of which have crashed and burned spectacularly, but have yielded some fun life lessons along the way. I have a blog that I contribute to fairly regularly on Medium that I encourage everyone to check out because I'm all about shameless plugs. And I play Ultimate Frisbee. So I'm very passionate about all of those things. So, shared understanding. If you have not read Jeff Patton's book, User Story Mapping, it is a fantastic book. I recommend every product person read User Story Mapping by Jeff Patton. But this is a quote from that book. Shared understanding is when we both understand what the other person is imagining and why. I think a lot of great product management, as opposed to good product management, is about going beyond just the what and understanding the why. It's really easy to take for granted that everyone else understands the same things that you do and all of the subtleties and context of the things that you understand. And when we fail to communicate that context is when we are communicating shared knowledge. But communicating something along with all of the context and some of the subtleties around around the why of why it is that we're saying we need to build that thing, or why it is that someone is asking for something, is where you start to really get to shared understanding. And this next slide, I think, highlights a little bit of the difference between shared knowledge and shared understanding. You can agree in terms on some of the substance of what you want, but until you really get down to it, put it on paper, have real conversations about what it is that you think you need, that you can develop a sort of shared understanding. Now, starting off, we're going to talk about how we have conversations with users so that we can really understand the problem. A lot of times this is how the interaction with users go. You talk to a user, hopefully you get to talk to users. We'll talk about that. A user says what they want. They have a problem on the left. They tell you what they want, and we go back and we build it. A lot of times this is a flawed premise because users don't always communicate exactly what they need. The nature of innovative software is that innovative software solves problems that people understand with solutions that they might not have asked for. So this is kind of how it looks. This is the ideal, right? Where we take what the user is asking for, and we poke and prod and figure out what is belying their requests, what's belying their wants and needs in terms of the problem that we need to solve as product people. And of course, then we're going to take that back to our team and actually solve that problem. The fun part happens when you start putting in intermediaries. So maybe you're working with a sales organization, and the sales organization is hearing something from a user, and then they're telling you what they think the user said they want. You start to get further and further removed from the problem. Or, this is my favorite, if you're in a B2B, B2B environment, you might get something that looks more like this, where you have a customer who's telling a salesperson what a user said, and then that salesperson is relaying that information back to you. You can start to understand how you can lose the message of the key problem that you're trying to solve. And ultimately, it's that user that determines whether or not your product is successful. So, skip the slide. Here we go. So this is what I call it's the spectrum of user interactions. So the key here is to understand when you are in the discovery phase versus the validation phase. The discovery phase is when you don't know anything. You might not even know the exact problem that you're trying to solve, but you know that there is a user out there who needs some help, or a customer that feels like there's a problem to be solved, and you need to understand it better so that you can come up with a solution to it. As you go along, you might identify a problem that you think you want to solve. You might start to come up with some solutions on what you think might solve that problem. And that's when you get into this validation phase. You are trying to figure out whether or not the solution that you have come up with actually solves the problem that you're out to solve. I think a lot of times closing that loop is something that product people don't follow through with. It's easy to just assume that what we come up with is going to solve a problem. We rely on quote unquote common sense really heavily. And because of that, there can be common sense solutions to problems that don't actually end up solving those problems. And as a result, a high proportion of the solutions that we develop end up failing. So you can kind of see on the left side here on the discovery phase, we're using things like observation and discovery interviews, watching our users and asking them about their problems, and maybe even getting into some sort of participatory design, where we're asking users to maybe show us what it is that they think might solve their problem. We, of course, understand that we of course understand that those things might not necessarily be perfect, but by understanding what it is that the user is visualizing, we can come up with some insightful things about what might actually solve their problem. When we start getting into more of the validation phase, we're getting more into usability testing and things like A/B testing if you have the infrastructure to do that sort of thing. But usability testing, I'll say, is probably my favorite technique in the validation side of things. Putting a product or a prototype of a product in front of your users and asking them to perform tasks that will solve their problem is a really powerful way to arrive at really valuable a really valuable shared understanding of what it is that your users need, especially when you start to get into the minutia of the UX that you've designed to solve their problem. And so, yeah, like we've said, so these are tips for these various phases. So when we start talking about discovery, part of the issue here is this game of telephone. And we'll see that this game of telephone pops up all over the place. If you're talking to a person who's talked to a person who's talked to a person, you start to get this loss of message. The message of what they think will solve their problem degrades. And not only that, but the feedback loop of the feedback loop of getting more information and elaborating on that need starts to really get lost. So as a product manager here, I don't have a really direct way to ask more questions and understand more deeply what the user wants, because the salesperson's got to go back to their customer, who's got to go back to their user, and the communication chain is inevitably going to break down. So the first thing that we can do as a team of product people is to get in front of our users. This is usually easier said than done. I think for me at Qventus, one of the ways that we do this is by traveling to our users. At Qventus, the users that we build for are in hospitals all over the country. And so as a product manager, I end up spending a fair bit of my time traveling around the country, spending time in hospitals talking to users. And I've had people ask me whether or not I think that is a lot of time to invest for something as kind of minor as just talking to a nurse about why we think about why a particular product is useful for them and why I can't do the same thing over the phone. And we do some things over the phone, but getting in front of my users getting in front of our users really allows us to understand their context. It allows us to ask really insightful questions. We can read their body language. We can see the environment that they're coming from, and we can interact with them in that environment rather than trying to pull them out or trying to imagine what it is that they're dealing with. And by kind of being there, it allows us to really get in depth with some great discovery tactics. And just to get tactical, because I like sharing little just kind of bits of information, one of my favorite techniques when I'm in the discovery phase is something that I call the 5 whys, and something that a lot of people call the 5 whys. I certainly didn't make it up. The 5 whys is a process of asking why. And I like to frame it in a certain way of, by asking why to your users a bunch of times, you can start to get to the root cause of what the problem is. It's a really easy way to get to the root cause of what the problem is that they're trying to solve. So if your user comes to you and says, I think it would be great if your product had a login button that was green. Like, okay, well, why do you need it to be green? Well, I need it to be green because right now it's blue and all of the rest of the things that I deal with on a regular basis are blue. Maybe not the greatest example, but you can start to understand why it is that asking why over and over and over again allows us to kind of dig deeper, and why it's important to dig a little bit deeper and go beyond just what users are asking for and start to understand what problem it is that they're trying to solve. The key principle, I believe, with regards to discovery is to challenge mental models. The way that we do that is by creating sort of informed hypotheses is to create kind of informed hypotheses about what we think the user's world is like, what problems we might be able to solve, and then come in really, really well, really prepared to destroy those hypotheses. It's kind of a scientific method sort of thing where we have hypotheses and we really want to challenge those hypotheses. Sometimes it helps to actually just write them down. Oftentimes before I go on a trip to see some users, I might say, hey, here are the core hypotheses that I'm going to try and challenge on this trip. It kind of goes into that kind of classic firm beliefs loosely held axiom. I believe it's a Reid Hoffmanism. And you really have to come in with firm beliefs loosely held. I think it's a really, really important thing with discovery. And in terms of challenging your mental models, it's about figuring out what are sort of the preconceived notions of solutions to problems that we're carrying in, and how can we challenge those? And I'll give you an example. This is probably one of the better, perhaps apocryphal examples of reframing a problem. So starting in the top left here, this is imagine a design firm, and you're brought in, and the residents of a building are complaining because the elevator is too slow. They say, please make the elevator faster. So living in a solution space, you might say, okay, well, how can we make the elevator faster? We're going to upgrade the motor. We're going to improve the elevator's algorithm. We're going to do all these things to actually make the elevator faster. Those all seem pretty expensive. They're pretty expensive, fairly time consuming. It's a less tenable actual solution, really resource intensive. By reframing the problem by saying it's not that the elevator is too slow, it's that users perceive that the elevator is too slow. So how can we make them feel like the elevator is not slow? How can we make them feel like the time between when they arrive in the lobby of the elevator and the time when they get to where they're going, how can we shorten that period of time in their minds? And so we'll make the wait feel shorter by doing things like putting up mirrors in the elevator lobby, playing music, installing a hand sanitizer, giving people something to do to sort of distract them and make them feel like the wait isn't quite as long. I think this is a really great example of living in problem space and understanding, reframing the problem and finding solutions to the actual problem rather than just going off of what exactly people ask for. And again, this is a great example of how you might use a technique like the 5 whys. You can ask, oh, why is it that you feel like the elevator is too slow? There's a lot here. There's a lot that we could break down here about. There's a lot here that we could break down, but I'll just mention this reframing the problem exercise is good because it allows us to find prototypes that are fairly low effort. It's really easy to test whether or not playing music in an elevator lobby is going to improve the user's experience. And it's fairly hard to experiment on how a faster lift might make the whole situation better. I think when we're building products, it's really important to challenge ourselves to figure out what are the sort of prototype discussions and the prototype experiences that we can build that might test how a particular problem is going to be solved. So we've talked about discovery. We're going to talk a little bit about validation. Once you've come up with these solutions, you've come up with these prototype experiences, there's I break down validation into 4 big risks, and there are techniques for each of these that we'll talk about a little bit. So there's value risk. Will customers and users perceive something as solving an important problem? So you're not going to use something unless you feel like you're going to get some value out of it. In order to test that, I really do believe that things like A/B testing and usership testing are really valuable here. You can understand whether or not users are going to enjoy using your product and whether or not they're going to feel like they're getting something out of it. There's usability risk. Can users figure out how to get that value out of your product? And this is where usability testing really starts to shine as a technique. Whether or not your users can actually accomplish a given task is really important. And I'll say, in terms of the user, usability and value are the two biggest risks when you're talking about things that impact the user. Because if a user understands that something is potentially valuable, but they can't achieve that value through a lack of usability, that's pretty frustrating. If a product is inherently usable, but a user doesn't understand what they're going to get out of it, they're never going to use it. The last two are kind of non-user facing, but are still really important for us to validate. And that's feasibility risk, is can it be built at all? This is really important to keep in mind if you are, if you are doing what great product people do and building prototypes that are not necessarily code. If we're doing things like wireframing and collaboratively doing design with our users in a way that doesn't leverage a lot of code, we need to make sure that what we're representing to the user is actually feasible from a product perspective, or at least we need to keep that feasibility in mind. And there are ways that you can arrive at this that we'll actually talk about a little bit later in the talk. But the short answer is you need to get your engineering team, or at least your engineering leadership, involved really early in sort of the discovery process, so that you can understand sort of the range of what your product might be able to do. And then lastly, I'll touch on business viability risk. Does it mesh with our business? Can we sell it? Is there a support structure in place to support this product? Can our salespeople sell it? Does it match our marketing? Does it match our business mantra? Does it match our values? Does it pair well with our other products? And this is something where I think discussions with company leadership can help to sort of dispel this risk, can help to assess this risk, as well as conversations with go-to-market team. So maybe you have a marketing team, a product marketing manager that you work with, or just salespeople that represent your product to potential customers. It's important to have representation of those groups, at least on some sort of recurring basis, so that you can understand what it is that they need in order to sell this product, because it's pretty important to make sure if something's valuable and usable, but we can't sell any of it, then we're not going to get any value from it as a product people trying to create value. So touching a little bit on sort of assessing the user-facing things of validation. So talking about value, talking about usability. Here are just like a few tips that we're going to talk about. The biggest tip that I can give you about understanding usability and value is to have someone show you rather than tell you. So this is, if I feel like I have a user experience that is particularly valuable, particularly usable, I'm going to put it in front of a user rather than asking someone, do you like this? Asking someone, do you like this, is problematic for a number of different reasons. There are a lot of things that I like that I'll probably never use. They seem nice in theory. You'll get a lot of people who are just inherently polite. They're taking their time. You're taking your time to communicate. No one likes being rude and giving tough feedback. And so this question of do you like this is really problematic. And it's really worth staying away from the question entirely, or at least pairing it with other things that allow us to actually get to the root of not only do they like it, but will they use it? Will they go out of their way to use it? Will they pay to use it? And so a few of the questions that I like subbing in anytime I think I'm going to ask whether or not someone's going to like this is, what price would you pay? How much do you think this is worth to you? Probably my all-time favorite is, if you were to pitch this to someone else, how would you do it? In a B2B situation, when I'm talking to a user, I might ask them, if you were to go and imagine a world where you decided you really loved this product and you were going to go sell it to your boss, how would you go about doing it? What value would you communicate to your boss in order to try and convince them that this is something that you needed? And it's really interesting, because in that moment, you really start to understand whether or not a user truly thinks that your product is valuable, because if they're having a really hard time coming up with things that they might say to sell your product to someone else, they don't understand the value, and you've identified at least some gap in value risk. And the last one there is maybe you're a little bit more towards the discovery phase. You've identified a few different problems that you might solve. This is a technique that I really like utilizing when I'm kind of trying to decide which of a few different problems I might solve. Giving someone $100 and saying, if you were me, how would you divvy up your resources solving each of these problems? And that kind of, again, gets to value, right? So we're trying to figure out which of these problems are most valuable to solve right now. The other way, by the way, is to just ask them to buy something. I mean, Kickstarter is a great example of people proving out value by asking people to actually buy their product before it even exists. It's a great example, and it's those sorts of techniques are absolutely replicable in all sorts of environments. So, hopefully, by virtue of all of these discovery and validation discussions that we've had with our users, we have now a better understanding of what it is that our users need. And so then it's time to go and have conversations with stakeholders. And I think I'm not moving quite as quickly as I wanted to, so we're going to kind of hit some high points here. But this is often how the discussion goes between a product manager and their engineering team. Unfortunately, product manager comes and they say, I need something that is yellow and pointy. And of course, they're imagining this sort of weird star-shaped icon that I found, and the engineering team delivers them a triangle. Fits their requirements, but isn't actually going to solve the problem the same way. The way that we get around that, this problem is by building better empathy between our users and our customers, our users and our engineering team. Sorry, I'm just looking at chat. I love it. The thing to understand about engineers is that great engineers are motivated by users in pain. This is a really, really important, if you come away with nothing else from this talk, I would just say this line is really, really powerful. It's from Marty Kagan from his book Inspired, and I'm sure just most things that Marty Kagan does, he ends up talking about some version of this axiom. Great engineers are motivated by users in pain. So as product people, more so than communicating requirements of the things that we're trying to ask our engineers to build, we can promote productful conversations about what it is that our users want and why they want those things. Conveying that empathy. As product manager, it's our job to really gain deep empathy with our users. But I would say more important than that, or maybe just as important as that, is then conveying that empathy to our teams so that they can build products which are really great. As product managers with just artifacts like Jira tickets or product requirements, we can't convey a true shared understanding of what it is that users need just through documentation and ticketing. And so we're kind of stuck in this game of telephone, right? Where a user is telling us what they want and we're telling the engineers what the users want. And we're hoping that we get something great as a result. So how do we beat the game of telephone? How do we perfectly translate users' needs to our engineers? And this is a sort of good, better, best exercise. Good is sharing insights from users. Better is having real collaborative discussions about users and their needs. And best is actually exposing your users or your engineers to your users. Last week, I took a trip to New York City to a hospital customer of ours, and I took two of the engineers from my team. And it was amazing, the frequency of occurrence of these aha moments where they realized why we built that feature, or why it is that something might work this way. Why users ask for this one thing over and over again that doesn't make any sense to the engineers in a vacuum, because they are 20-something tech savvy software engineers living in Silicon Valley, and our users are 40-something-year-old non-tech savvy nurses living in Minnetonka, Minnesota. Those two people think really, really differently, and oftentimes it's hard to put yourself in their shoes unless you actually go and interact with them. And even then, it's still hard, but it at least gets us closer. I'm going to talk really quickly on the life cycle of a feature so we can see where some of these conversations I'm going to suggest fit. There's the key thing to focus on here. We start with discovery. We learn about what we want to build. We ask the team to commit to it. Then they build it. The issue with asking a team to build something is that we have this notion of the done zone. this notion of done. Done can mean pretty much anything when it comes to software development. And it's really important to, again, come to a shared understanding of what we mean when we talk about done. And so talking about done, here are some of the things that I have. These are actual quotes from people. Sure, it's done, but is it done? It's done, but now we just need to finish it. And is anything ever done? So people getting into this existential crisis around the definition of done. And so it's really important to understand what it is that we're asking our teams to do by coming up with a shared definition of done. These are all the different things that might represent done. Pretty much, I see it based on who is part of the team that you're asking to get something done. And so developing a definition of done is all about coming up with a checklist. The things that we mean when we say done. Maybe we just mean code complete. Maybe we mean QA testing has signed off on a feature. Maybe it has to be released. There's some fungibility. I don't think there's any one 100% right definition of done. It kind of depends on your organization and your processes. But it is really important, whatever the definition of done is for you, that everyone on the team understands that definition and has agreed that that is what we mean when we talk about getting something done. So now let's talk about a couple different conversations that are gonna help us get from here's something we might want to build to now it's done. The first is the three amigos. I like to call this is just kind of these are your go-to people, right? It's your engineering lead, it's your design lead, and yourself. And this is a team that should be fairly close. There should be a healthy friction here of a product manager asking for the world, a designer telling you what's realistic from a UX perspective, and an engineering lead telling you what's realistic from an engineering perspective. And each person kind of contributing their ideas of, how can we stretch the design? How can we do something cool with the design that you might not be thinking about? How can we implement some new technology into the product? The engineering lead might say, how can we implement some new and exciting technology to do things that you might not even be thinking are possible right now? And this is a great group that gets together kind of as often as needed to talk about things that are really early stage in the process. And going back to what we were talking about validation, this is a great venue in which to test viability risk or feasibility risk. This is a great venue to talk about, like, hey, can we design a UX that does this efficiently? And can we build something that achieves this functionality? I'm going to skip over this. We're going to talk about story time. So story time is when we actually go and communicate our user story requirements to our team. This is a venue where we talk about what our users want. Is we frame the product requirements in terms of why it is that users want these things. It's really important, I think, for a product manager to make themselves available to their team to talk about these sorts of things. I like having them weekly, once an hour, or an hour once a week. I think it's a really great conversation to have. In these venues, I really challenge my team to wonder why I'm suggesting certain things. And there have certainly been times where I've suggested functionality that we need to build, and the engineering team has asked really good, challenging questions that have, at the very least, told me that I haven't done enough validation, or sometimes they've just pointed out holes in my understanding to where we ended up not building that thing because we decided it was going to be a bad idea. And so story time is really important. It helps us get from a point where we have an idea of what we want to build to an understanding of why we want to build it. And then even beyond why we want to build it, the engineering team has the opportunity to think about how they might build it before the sprint starts. And by virtue of that, we can do things like come up with better estimates and ultimately have more predictable sprints, which is a great thing for a number of different reasons. And then the last thing I'll talk about is retrospectives. Once we've gone through this process of building, it's really important to go back and talk about how our process for building helped us get from user understanding to done. And I think it's important to bring to this conversation an openness to feedback. It's really, really important. How I think the best way that I've seen of framing feedback in a way that promotes openness and honesty is blank happened. It made me feel blank. So, we rushed out this feature. It made me feel like my work isn't being valued, or it made me feel like we're not valuing quality. These are things that can really help to promote an honest discussion amongst the team. And a retrospective can sometimes get into kind of touchy subjects, but it's a really, really valuable meeting. It's important, the tips that I'll give, it's important to talk about the positives. It's really easy to focus on the negatives. And I think it's really valuable in a retro to talk about all the things that a team did right. Even if the goal is to talk about how we can do things a little bit better next time. And so the number one goal of a retro is to come up with one process experiment to run between now and your next retro. And there are a whole bunch of interesting things that you might try with your team. I'll just share one. My team, I felt like my team and I, we discussed, and everyone was getting a little bit too siloed on their own work. We were missing things. There were mistakes being made in other people's code that in one engineer's code that another engineer would have noticed fairly easily. And so we actually got rid of ticket assignment. We got rid of the notion of anyone owning any ticket. And as a result, every engineer had to understand what was the state of every other ticket. And by virtue of that, we promoted a lot of ownership amongst the team. We only did that for a little bit of time, but it really helped to open up lines of communication amongst the team. And then the absolute very last thing I'll say is that aside from all of these things, these really structured conversations with our teams, the most important conversations we have with our team are the ones that aren't on the calendar. And it's really important for us to make ourselves available to our teams as often and as frequently as we can. The best way to do this is by actually sitting with your team. The more touch points you have with your team, the more opportunity it is that your team has to ask you questions, the more shared understanding we're going to develop. And ultimately, that's why we're here. We're here to help promote shared understanding between engineers and users in pain. And that's all I have. Thank you all for having me. I think we're going to do some QA, and I think I'm going to switch over to video so y'all can see my ugly mug, and we'll pop into the chat. By the way, I love the comments. I was trying not to get too distracted by chat during the talk, but I love the feedback. So thank you all. I think Jeff commented, "Done is closing the loop and bringing requirements back for the next round." I'll just say one brief thing about that. I think there's this notion of kind of engineering doneness. I think there's also about code being complete and features being deployed. There's this notion that I really, really like about, I've heard it called product debt. And, as opposed to tech debt, where we have these kind of band-aids over certain pieces of our technical solution, product debt is when we don't understand what value, if any, some piece of functionality brings to our users. And so it's really important for a product manager to bring back not just did it get completed and talk about how we got work completed, but whether or not the work that we completed ended up being valuable. Because ultimately, if we have an engineering team that's really efficient, but the things that we deliver aren't valuable to users, then that's a process that doesn't work. And so there's some, so like Jeff said, might go as far as ROI. It's true. Yeah. So there's all sorts of different definitions of done that we might look at. And it's really important to understand those different tiers of it, and to bring that understanding back to our teams, because once an engineering team is done building, it's up to us. Yeah, it's up to us to bring back, exactly, KPIs and analytics and user feedback to our teams to help them understand what it is that we might do in the future to build things that are valuable. How do you defend your decisions as these other stakeholders will inevitably challenge them? That's a great question. I think defending your decisions. It's a lot about bringing relevant data feedback and defending your decisions with feedback from users. So there are a lot of ways to validate the things that we're suggesting. If there's not adequate amounts of validation that have been done, you're going to end up with a lot of skeptical engineers. And now the way that I like to think about validation, kind of the litmus test for it, is the number of times that I have to wield that. If I ever have to wield I'm the PM, I need you guys to trust me on this. If I ever have to wield that, if I ever have to wield that, then I've made a mistake. I haven't done enough validation, enough communication of value. And Rafa elaborated. And what about other stakeholders beyond engineers? I think it's really important. All those same messages apply. That validation, you might not have as much time, as much opportunity to communicate to leadership or your marketing or sales teams why it is that you're working on particular things as you might with your engineering team, who hopefully you just sit with and you talk to every day. And for them, I think it's about boiling it down. I'll just say from my personal experience, quotes from users are incredibly important. There's a lot of focus these days, I think, on data. And data can tell a really great story, but a story can also tell a really great story. And anecdotal evidence paired with data really helps to drive points home. And so I'll just utilizing that sort of information to your benefit is going to be to your benefit. Thank you. Okay. You said you are a data science PM. What is required to become one? I'm a PM working on AI chatbots also. So yeah, I think really it's about AI. In short, AI is just kind of, I think, a little bit more difficult for most people to understand. I think that if you really want to build machine learning tools and sort of AI tools, you have to be able to branch that technical understanding that people have. As a PM, it's our job to take one of our many jobs is to take what our engineers are building and communicate them in terms that everyone else can understand. With something like if I'm a PM and I'm building a front end for a mobile app, there's a lot of complexity there, but by virtue of whatever the CEO can touch it and interact with it and understand it a little bit more than they might be able to understand like a machine learning model. And so you have to be a little bit more technical because you have to be able to reach into the world of what engineers are doing and translate that work into something that everyone else can understand. Other questions. How to be sure that the improvement in user engagement was because of new A feature and not continuous improvement in BCD features? Yeah, it's really hard. That's really hard. We start to get into concepts of like A/B testing that I didn't necessarily get into an incredible amount of depth with. Cohort testing is a really great way to isolate value of different features. Not everyone has the luxury of doing that. Personally, where my company works in a B2B software as a service environment where we don't have like our actual number of users is not that huge. We don't have a ton of users. We might have 20, 50, 100 users in every hospital that we work with, and we work with maybe 80 hospitals around the country. We don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do A/B testing. We don't have cohorts large enough, and so it sometimes is tough. There are things you can do if you're measuring usership. You can correlate value with usership of particular features, or you can ask people. Ultimately, I think people focus maybe a little bit too much on trying to isolate whether it's feature A, B, C, or D, and it's just about understanding your product. If you can't understand how any particular feature delivers value, you can understand how your product as a whole delivers value and try to improve on that and iterate accordingly. Nikhil, I love the Henry Ford quote. I think in previous versions of this talk, I have included that exact quote. If I asked people what they wanted, I would have built a faster horse. I'll just as a cautionary tale, Henry Ford is a cautionary tale because he did some amazing things in building Ford to what it is, implementing automation and all these sorts of things. But if you look, what ended up biting him in the butt was this idea of I know what users want. I'm going to deliver what users want. To heck with what they ask for. One of his other famous quotes is, "You can have a Model T in any color you want, so long as it's black." He really just he was a big fan of telling people what they wanted, and as a result, you had other car companies like I think it was like Chrysler and GM. By partway through the 1940s, had almost met Ford in terms of market share, and with things like customization, like options for customization that you see now in cars all the time, very commonplace. And so there's a bit of a cautionary tale of like, yes, you do need to be able to take a stance on what it is that users actually need, and you need to be able to innovate, but you also need to be open to their feedback, and you need to understand what it is that they want. The question there is, how do you ask the right kind of questions? I think asking why is a really great way to do that. Putting yourself in the user's shoes and seeing not just what they're asking for, but understanding what problems that they're having. I try to stay away in the discovery phase from asking users what they want, and I more ask them what problems they're having. Not only can that help you kind of connect with the user because they want to know that someone cares about their problems, but it'll help you get to a common understanding of what it is that's really causing them pain, as opposed to asking them. If you're asking them to tell you what to build, not only are users going to think like, oh, you're kind of asking me to do your job, but you're asking a user to kind of do things that are maybe not quite in their wheelhouse in terms of suggesting functionality that are going to solve their problems. Can you spend 2 minutes cohort testing? So cohort testing is a sort of it's ideally a statistically significant method for testing whether or not a given feature is valuable. I'll take that back. It does not have to be statistically significant. I would say beta testing is an example of cohort testing, and that's something that you can use a lot. If you have power users that are really hungry for new functionality, and they might be a little bit more tolerant of things like minor bugs and things like that, then that sort of cohort testing can be really valuable as sort of a litmus test of whether or not your latest product idea, your latest feature idea is going to deliver value. And it kind of scales up. I mean, you can look at kind of Facebook's model or Spotify's model as good examples of how to promote A/B testing. I think at Facebook, any old engineer has the ability to run like a 10,000 user A/B test with some new feature without having to get anyone's approval. They have some amazing infrastructure in place to allow for that sort of thing. Not everyone is Facebook. Not everyone has as many users or as great a infrastructure for doing that sort of testing. And I think Inspired by Marty Kagan, I believe, has a section on cohort testing that's pretty good, which bridges really well into the next question about books for PMs, about building data-related features. I think it's important, I think, to dispel some of the notion that like AI is some big profound different style of product management. I think it's really easy to assume that it is, but a lot of times all AI is doing is solving a problem in a way that a user really hadn't thought of before. So not just the screen is going to look differently from what you thought it might, but instead of a screen, there's going to be someone talking to you, or a robot talking to you, or whatever, right? A lot of times AI solutions come out of left field in terms of like what a user expected and what might actually solve their problem. And so I think as an AI, if in order to like be an AI product manager, it takes a little bit of that kind of gut understanding of what is feasible with AI, what can you do, and some of the limitations. I mean, from my experience, AI and ML, AI and ML have some limitations that are really important to understand. But in terms of books, some of the ones I've mentioned already, just in terms of, it's important to bring product management fundamentals to any sort of product management, especially building data related features. There are some great, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, and this is going to kill me. I can't remember the name of the books right now. It's a series of data visualization, like communicating data through design books. And I can't remember the author's name, but I'll post them on my website, jackmoore.us/books. Oh, wait, I'm posting private, everyone. I'll post on I'll make sure it's included on my website. And yeah. And so and it has a bunch of other books on, like, it has a section on self-improvement books that I really like and product management books that I really like. And so if you're looking for book recommendations, that would be the number one place I'd point you to. Cool.
I think we have covered all the questions. Yeah. So
great questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Jack, for conducting such an insightful session. And for those who don't know, who joined late, Jack has also conducted sessions with us in the past. So we'll keep on doing sessions with you, and we really love these insightful sessions.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'm sure everyone would have some concrete takeaways from this session. Lastly, I would like to thank all the participants for joining us. And before we end this session, I would like to give you all a little brief. So we run a Slack community of product managers. It's a global community, and you can join our community. I'll share link into the description, and also we'll share this recording of session on our YouTube channel, so you can anytime check out our videos. You can reach out to us. You can reach out to Jack. And thanks a lot once again, Jack, for joining us, and thanks everyone for joining me.